Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue shows kind of a sharp contrast to some of the other tissues that we've talked about because one of the most distinct features of most connective tissues is that they're largely acellular, and what I mean by that is that cells really don't make up the majority of the total volume of the tissue. Now, certainly when I say that's a little bit of a misnomer. When I say acellular, I don't mean there's no cells there. I just mean there's not very many cells there for most connective tissues. So we're going to see here that if cells don't make up most of the volume of the tissue, what does? The thing that actually makes up most of the volume here is what is called the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix not only comprises a lot of extracellular fluid, but also a lot of secreted proteins, carbohydrates, enzymes, and minerals that are secreted by cells in the extracellular matrix of the connective tissue to help to maintain an environment that helps to promote what the connective tissue does. And what it does is something that we'll kind of touch on as we go through here. So as far as what the actual function of connective tissue is, that's a little hard to nail down because what we're going to see here is that connective tissues are very diverse and they have a lot of different functions depending on kind of where you're looking in the body. But in general, connective tissue is going to be found in and around organs and other tissues and major structures in the body and kind of help to serve the purpose of connecting and binding those tissues together and then enabling the functions of those structures in whatever way is appropriate for whatever you happen to be talking about. So if we had to categorize the connective tissues, the first thing we can do is categorize them as connective tissue proper, which includes both loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. These are going to be the connective tissues you largely see in the space in between organs and other structures in the body. You have supportive connective tissues, which serve a much more solid structural function, whether you're talking about cartilage, which helps to lubricate joints and things of that nature, and bone, of course, which is a part of the skeleton, which is obviously very, very solid in terms of its structural support roles. And then a couple of types of connective tissue, which you might not normally think as being a tissue, fluid connective tissues, which include both blood and lymph. So if we start by talking about the connective tissue proper, you can see both an illustration on the left and a histological section on the right, which is what you might see under the microscope. Connective tissues largely are going to be characterized by two different things. What kinds of cells do you find there? And we've already established that you're not going to see as many cells as you see proteins and other things in the actual matrix. And then what sorts of proteins do you find in the extracellular matrix? So if you look at the illustration on the left, you can see a lot of crisscrossing proteins. This is going to include a lot of collagen, which is kind of the majority protein that you find in the extracellular matrix. But you're going to find a lot of other proteins like keratin and elastin and fibronectin. So the list goes on and on and on. We'll talk about just a handful of them, but you're going to find a lot of proteins here. A lot of these proteins are modified with carbohydrate chains. In that case, we call those proteoglycans. You're going to find a lot of enzymes here. You're going to find a lot of minerals. You're going to find a lot of other molecules like chondroitin sulfate and hyaluronic acid, which serve a number of different functions in terms of kind of binding everything together and lubricating everything. But as we say down here, we're mostly going to focus on what kinds of proteins do we find and what kinds of cells do we find. And as far as cells go, you can find adipocytes, which are fat-storing cells, and we'll have more to say about them very soon. You can find mesenchymal cells. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about fibroblasts, which really help to produce a lot of the materials that you find in the extracellular matrix. And then we're going to see that there is some presence of the immune system here. You can see a type of immune cell called a macrophage here. So if we first start by focusing on the cells that we find in connective tissue, the first one we want to focus on are called fibroblasts. Fibroblasts actually synthesize and secrete a lot of the proteins and polysaccharides that you find in the extracellular matrix into the extracellular fluid, and this combination of proteins and carbohydrates and other materials make up what is called the ground substance in the extracellular matrix. So you can think of the ground substance as being the acellular component of the extracellular matrix, which is to say most of it, right? Then, of course, you're going to find the adipocytes. These, of course, are fat-storing cells that store large volumes of triglycerides in their cytoplasm, and as we're going to see in the next few slides, they come in a couple of different varieties: white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. So as adults, most of us, we are much more familiar with white adipose tissue. These are going to function in long-term fat storage. If you actually look at what these cells look like, you can see that the vast majority of the cytoplasmic volume of these cells is taken up with these large fat droplets that are stored up. You can really get the picture here as far as how much of the volume is taken up here, because you can see the cell's nucleus is kind of pushed off to the edge towards the plasma membrane, not unlike what we saw with skeletal muscle fibers. So, like I said, most of the cytoplasmic volume is taken up with these fat droplets. But what we're going to see here is that white adipose cells, which are called white adipocytes, they have very low, very slow metabolic rates, meaning that when these cells store up fats, they're not doing it for their own benefits, right? So we've talked before about how much energy triglycerides store up and how you can potentially make a lot of ATP by putting those triglycerides, putting those fatty acids through beta oxidation, which is a part of cellular respiration. But because these white adipocytes do not have very many mitochondria, they don't really have the capability to make a lot of ATP themselves. So what they really do is just store up the fat for long-term usage. And then potentially, and we'll look at this in the future, they actually do respond to hormones like glucagon to kind of metabolize and release some of their stored fat when necessary, when the body is in a bit of an energy deficit and we need to use that fat for something. So that is in stark contrast to brown adipocytes, brown adipose tissue. Now, this is a stark contrast because these cells actually do have a lot of mitochondria, and as such, they have much higher metabolic rates, and they can actually metabolize and break down these fatty acids and triglycerides very quickly for the sake of making energy. Now, it's not so much that they are making energy because they need the ATP for themselves. The ATP is not exactly the end-all be-all here. The main purpose of these cells is that when they make ATP, they produce a lot of heat. So you learned in general biology through the second law of thermodynamics that no energy conversion process is 100% efficient. Whatever energy you don't harvest for yourself, you're going to lose as heat. So as these cells rapidly metabolize their stored fats, they radiate a lot of heat. This is a process called thermogenesis. This is something you see very often in infants and newborns who do not have very well fine-tuned thermoregulation systems like we've studied before. So in order to keep babies warm, they have a lot of this brown adipose tissue that is constantly metabolizing a lot of fat that the babies are getting from the breast milk that they're drinking or whatever they happen to be feeding on. So babies need lots of fat to feed this brown adipose tissue for the sake of keeping them warm. As such, brown adipose tissue largely starts to disappear in adults because we by then have developed our thermoregulation systems by using our hypothalamus to sense when the body temperature gets too hot or too cold. So we don't really need the brown adipose tissue anymore. So we largely do not have very much of this stuff by the time we reach adulthood. Okay, moving on to the next types of cells that you'll find in connective tissue, you have mesenchymal cells. These are multipotent stem cells, very much like the hematopoietic stem cells that we talked about before. they have the potential to turn into several different types of cells, and they can be used to replace any cells that are lost due to connective tissue injury. Although you might be aware that a lot of connective tissue injuries are somewhat slow to heal, not because these mesenchymal cells are bad at their jobs, but oftentimes because a lot of connective tissues, especially those you find in cartilage, are very far away from the blood supply, so it takes a little while to deliver nutrients to those areas to help to get these mesenchymal cells to do their jobs. And then finally, you have macrophages and other components of the immune system. These are not natural endogenous cells in the extracellular matrix. They often have to be recruited to the connective tissue from the blood stream by using short-distance chemical signals, which we're going to learn more about very soon, called paracrine signals. So we will have a future video, probably when we start talking about the blood itself in Chapter 18, about how this recruitment works. You might be thinking, well, how does a cell get pulled out of the bloodstream to get into the connective tissue? That'll be something that we address in the future. Okay, so now let's talk about some of these protein fibers. The first and most important one is collagen. This is a triple helical protein, meaning that you have 3 different polypeptides that come together and latch onto each other. We've talked about collagen synthesis before and the importance of vitamin C acting as a coenzyme for the 2 enzymes prolyl hydroxylase and lysyl hydroxylase, which help to modify each of the collagen strands so that they can bind together. So collagen is very important because it has very high elasticity and tensile strength and really helps to hold cells in the connective tissue together and really helps to hold endothelial cells and epithelial cells down to the extracellular matrix. Oftentimes you will find a protein called elastin, which, given the name, has a very high capacity to stretch and not lose its original shape. When you talk about something being elastic, you can stretch it out, and then when you let go of it, it can bounce back and retake its original shape. And then another important protein is fibronectin, which helps epithelia and other cells to bind to the extracellular matrix, not unlike what we just talked about with collagen. Now, these are the 3 proteins we're kind of focusing on here, but by no means are these the only proteins that you're going to find in the ground substance of extracellular matrix. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about fibronectin. So fibronectin has a very close relationship with a membrane protein that you find in a lot of epithelial cells. These proteins are called integrins, and you can see them down here in the basolateral membrane, and they are shaded in purple. Integrins are junction proteins that you will find in the basolateral membranes of cells that like to stick to the extracellular matrix. So what these integrins do is as they are integral membrane proteins and they go all the way through this basolateral membrane, on the extracellular side, they stick to the fibronectin that you find in the ground substance, as you can see here. That's what all these squiggly lines are. And then I didn't really illustrate it in here, but on the intracellular side, the integrins bind to the cell's actin network. So it would be like if you wanted to stick to the ground and make it so that you can never get pulled out of the ground, you could maybe find a way to latch the ground onto your skeleton, right? So that would make sure that you could never get pulled off of the ground. Kind of a bad example, but that's not unlike what is happening here. There is a functional structural connection between the underlying proteins in the ground substance and the actin skeleton that is inside the cell. That basically makes it so that these epithelial cells can never get pulled off of the underlying ground substance in the extracellular matrix. Okay, so that covers the integrins. It's also worth mentioning that you can obviously see the tight junctions that help to hold these neighboring epithelial cells together, but those tight junctions don't really hold them together like I was saying. We saw before that they help to prevent paracellular transport. It's not really illustrated here, but the junction proteins that really help to hold these cells together so they can't get pulled apart from each other are proteins called cadherins. We're not really going to talk about them here, but they help to hold cells to each other, kind of like how integrins help to hold individual cells down to the extracellular matrix. Now that's really all we're going to say about connective tissue for right now. There's other types of connective tissue that we will talk about in the future, but they're really going to deserve their own videos. Bone and cartilage we will talk about in Chapter 6, especially with regard to how they function in calcium homeostasis. We'll talk about blood in Chapter 18, and then we'll talk about lymph in Chapter 21. So these different types of connective tissues, we're not going to talk about them now, but they will have their time in the sun in the future. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms you probably ought to be aware of. And for checking your understanding, number 1, where do the materials in the ground substance come from? Number 2, what distinguishes one kind of connective tissue from another? And number 3, for epithelial cells, how do they stick to each other and to the underlying connective tissue? All right, that's going to do it. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section for me. I will see you next time. So long.